recording in progress, and then I have to
inside an existing creosote lamp. In 2016, together with FNF and the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, I arranged a LED comparison test with most of the used LED sources at that time. We tested a complete workflow from camera to color grading, measuring both direct and reflected light. Many LED sources that had an excellent color value created a wax or plastic-looking skin when seen through the camera. The skin acts as a reflector and do not absorb the artificial light as it does under natural light. The result from this test were important for the future development of lights for the emigrants. We started by testing different existing LEDs, but didn't find anyone with the needed light quality, power, and size to fit inside a small oil lamp. We soon realized that all existing LEDs between 1800 and 2000 Kelvin was going towards green or magenta. They had a lack of color spectrum, missing color depth and saturation. I decided to develop my own light source by blending several LEDs. To develop the optimized LED and colors, we made a repeatable setup with a real flame, my daughter Hannah's face, my longtime gaffer Katalin Kalin, a color chart, and senior colorist Christian Wiberg Nielsen. We did an analog and rather low-tech test with a combination of our eyes, the ARRI-LF, and the Baselite color grading suite at Storyline in Oslo. We used the real flame as our target source. We then started to blend different types of LEDs. We repeated our workflow from source, camera, color grading, then adding new LEDs, did new tests, and analyzed again until we found an optimized blend of LEDs. We ended up with 4 different LEDs, 2200 Kelvin, amber, lime, and deep red. Both the LED battery and a specially developed electronics was hidden inside the unit. The light were remotely dimmed up and down during a scene with a free remote app from Kasambi. The flame LED gave us rich skin tones, good saturation, and much more flexibility in color grading.
Alex, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Apologies. I was just saying thank you very much, Christian. Very interesting presentation. I would ask that everybody on the call please add their affiliation to their name so we understand who's actually on the call and where you're coming from, point of view. We have another presentation from Felix Husen. Felix is a senior colorist and no slides, but Felix, feel free to jump in here and let us know your thoughts.
All right, thank you very much. I do have some slides, so I will just quickly share my screen. And I think, yeah, this way now I should see everything. So yeah, as a colorist, we of course face these problems every day with not just with LED lighting, but with mixed lighting, with different camera setups that we have to match. And so what John Christian just mentioned, with LED lights maybe lacking some color depth or some spectral power that we would like to have bouncing off our talent. This, as colorists, of course, is our daily job, to fix these things in post. And of course, everybody of you knows that. However, the problem actually extends into the grading suite. We're not just working on LED footage, we're also seeing LED light in the grading suite. So in our grading suite, we obviously have our reference monitor, and this reference monitor can be, for example, LED backlit or using OLED technology. And as some of you might know already, even if the monitors cost as much as a car, if you put an LED backlit one side by side with an OLED one, feed them the same signals, and both claim to be calibrated, the displays can look actually quite differently just because of the technology behind it. But then we have another issue in the grading suite, and that is our bias light. We have the bias light around the monitor in our field of vision to anchor our eyes to a neutral color, usually D65, and also to light up the room a little bit. Now, this bias lighting source could be a fluorescent tube, for example, or it could also be LED lighting, which becomes more and more popular. And there are, of course, special products for this purpose. And those products usually advertise with a CRI, color rendering index value to show people that they are accurate and that they accurately emit the 65 light or 6,500 Kelvin. Of course, this is another technology or a different brand than those LEDs found in the reference monitors. So there already we have another mismatch that can happen. And this morning in the grading suite, I did a little experiment. I took my photo camera with a fixed daylight white balance, and I just photographed the screen of a high-end reference LED backlit grading monitor displaying a gray test patch. So what we're seeing here is literally a photograph, and which I didn't alter. Then I put a gray frame around it digitally, and I was quite surprised that the camera of with a fixed white balance actually was pretty accurate in displaying the gray of the LED backlit grading monitor. Again, I'm gonna switch this order on and off so that you can see the that there's very little difference actually. But then I photographed the wall behind the monitor. So I took a picture of an fluorescent tube bias light hitting a screen or hitting a wall. And this has a CRI value of 95, which is really good actually. And yeah, the camera saw it like this. It was basically blue. The eyes didn't really see the difference that much, but there was a difference there, of course. So the camera does see something quite dramatically different. Then I tried out a different bias light, which was an LED bias light, high quality CRI 98. So you probably won't get better than that. And it looked even bluer to the camera. And again, we could also see differences with our eyes. So I think this is quite an interesting demonstration of how CRI values for this purpose can be a little bit misleading. Of course, I also took my spectro and I measured all those lights, and we can obviously see that those spectral power distributions are quite different. And this obviously is the underlying problem here, which we will talk about more tonight and or today. And I think this is also why the SSI, the Spectral Similarity Index, might be a promising way forward to compare light sources more or better, actually, and easier, so that post houses, for example, could just grab a high SSI value light and be sure that it matches the D65 reference, maybe. Because, yeah, at the end, we all end up in a grading suite eventually, right? So that's it for my quick presentation. Thanks a lot. And I look forward to the rest.
Thank you very much, Felix. That's actually an excellent lead in, I think, to George's presentation is going to be up next. George Jablov works at the Academy with me, and he has a presentation on SSI, or the Spectral Similarity Index. As an aside, I would invite everybody to add any questions that they may have to the chat. We do have a question and answer session, a couple of question and answer sessions, one sort of immediately following George's presentation. But if you want to sort of keep a running list of questions, that would be helpful for us to address those as we move forward. So George, I'll turn the con over to you here, and feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning or evening, wherever you are. I am George Jablov, Senior Director of Technology and Standards at the Science and Technology Council of the Motion Picture Academy. Thanks to Imago for providing us the opportunity to briefly describe SSI, the Spectral Similarity Index, and why we believe this can be a useful metric for cinematographers and gaffers, especially when working with LED lighting. And this presentation will be made available by Imago on its website, so you'll have a chance to digest the details in a separate sitting if you so desire. Next slide, please. So color is the sensing of the distribution of power across the visible spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. This spectrum is in the range to which human eyes are sensitive, which is about from 400 nanometers, which is perceived as blue, to 700 nanometers, which is perceived as red, measuring by wavelength. Next slide. But normally, the light we see is not a single wavelength. Rather, it's a mixture of many wavelengths across the visible spectrum. Light is characterized by its spectral power distribution, or SPD, across that range. That is, how much energy is present at each wavelength. This distribution for any light can be illustrated as a graph of relative power versus wavelength. So here you're seeing the SPDs for ISO photographic daylight, or CIE D55 on the left, and ISO studio tungsten on the right. And for clarity, we've shaded the area under the curves according to the perceived colors of the wavelengths. Next slide. Human vision and cameras are trichromatic. That is, color is sensed by 3 sets of receptors, each of which is measuring as a single value the amount of energy across a portion of the spectrum, with a particular degree of sensitivity at each wavelength. So color is being detected as 3 values, which can be characterized as red, green, and blue. Thus, color, as perceived by human eyes or sensed by film or digital sensor, is a 3-dimensional quantity. And this graph shows the relative sensitivities of the 3 receptors in the human eye, the 3 different cones we have in our retinas. This sort of graph can be created for any digital camera sensor or color film stock as well. Next slide. Chromaticity is color independent of luminance, as perceived by the human visual system. Since we've removed luminance from the equation, chromaticity is therefore a 2-dimensional quantity and is typically graphed like this, in which the horizontal axis here is a quantity called CIEX, and the vertical axis is CIEY. And in this coordinate system, all the colors that human eyes can see are represented by the horseshoe-shaped area. The pure, most highly saturated colors, which are all incidentally single wavelengths, are found on the curved edge of the horseshoe from 390 nanometer blue at the bottom left, up and around the curve to 700 nanometer red at the lower right. The so-called line of purples are hues, the sensation of which are not created by any single wavelengths. There's no purple in the rainbow, but created only by a mixture of red and blue. That line of purples is running along the bottom of the horseshoe area. In this diagram, saturation decreases inward toward the white point. It's important to note that different spectra can result in the same RGB output and the same chromaticity, and this results in the phenomenon known as metamerism. Next slide. Now, in the beginning, before the invention of artificial light sources, there was natural light. So for about the first 1,000,000 years of human existence, all lighting was by things basically on fire, or at least very hot, including, for example, the sun. Indeed, originally cinema lighting was too, including tungsten filaments. These light sources exist because matter emits energy as a function of its temperature. And with increasing temperature, power and peak frequency of the radiation increase. So the peak wavelength decreases. Now, the SPD of things on fire behaves much like those of so-called black bodies, which is a theoretical concept in physics. And this graph is showing the SPDs of black body emission at various temperatures in degrees Kelvin, plotted as power on the vertical axis on a logarithmic scale, as a function of wavelength on the horizontal axis, also on a logarithmic scale. The band of visible light is indicated in color. So in other words, between 400 and 700 nanometers. The yellow curve is at approximately the temperature of the surface of the sun, about 5,800 kelvins. And incidentally, you'll see there's a red curve at 300K. That's the temperature of human beings and other animals. Keep in mind, temperature in kelvins is equal to Celsius plus about 273. And so that yellow curve at 300 is showing why people glow white on infrared cameras, because we're emitting electromagnetic radiation at 300 Kelvin. The color temperature of a light source, such as a tungsten filament that behaves approximately like an ideal black body, is equal to its temperature in Kelvin. I really like this schematic because it gives a very clear picture of how color temperature relates to color, and in particular, how with increasing temperature, color starts warm because most of the emission at lower temperatures is in the invisible infrared and the red end of the visible spectrum. And then as the temperature increases, the color becomes whiter because the emission becomes more uniform as it rises towards the blue end of the spectrum. But the biggest takeaway from this is to notice that black body spectral power distributions are broad, smooth, and unimodal, so which is to say that there's a single peak to the curve. Next slide. Black body emission, incidentally, is also known as Planckian emission for Max Planck, who was the physicist who developed much of the theory in this area. If you plot black body emission as a function of temperature on the chromaticity diagram, you get the curved line or locus that you see here running through the lower middle. That's been labeled here in this schematic from 1,666 K to past 10,000 K. Now, SPDs on the black body locus can be described by their color temperature, the black body temperature that results in emission at that chromaticity. Color film and then digital sensors were optimized for black body SPDs, and in particular, tungsten incandescence and daylight. Next slide. For chromaticities that are not on the black body locus, the concept of color temperature is extended to correlated color temperature, or CCT. For any given chromaticity, this is the color temperature of the chromaticity on the black body locus that's closest. So in this diagram, lines of constant CCT are shown more or less perpendicular to the black body locus itself. This now gets us into the question of how color is described. Color temperature, or more precisely correlated color temperature, reduces the entire description of a color to a single one-dimensional value. It's not even specifying the chromaticity. Chromaticity, which is specified, for example, by X, Y, or effectively by a CCT and a green or magenta displacement off the black body locus, chromaticity is a bit more precise, but as only a two-dimensional value, it still is not specifying the spectrum of a light. And as I mentioned before, many different spectra can have the same chromaticity, but may illuminate surfaces differently. And that's something that was just touched on a few minutes ago. The only way to fully describe a color is by its spectrum. In other words, the relative power at each wavelength. And this is especially important with non-Planckian lighting. Next slide. So over the years, metrics have been developed to quantify illuminance ability to faithfully reveal the colors of surfaces reflecting them in comparison with natural lighting. But these indices are typically either based on human vision or on 3-chip broadcast television cameras, which are amongst themselves fairly consistent in their spectral sensitivities. But photographic film and single sensor digital cameras used in motion picture production have different spectral sensitivities than human vision and television cameras and differ from each other. So the existing indices don't adequately quantify illuminance for cinematography. It's not that these existing metrics are bad, rather they are being applied to something they were never intended for. And their inadequacies can be especially evident with LED lighting. Next slide. So let's look at how LED light differs from traditional sources. The smooth purple line here is the SPD of blackbody emission at about 5,000 Kelvin, 5,003 to be precise. The jagged red plot is the CIE daylight spectrum of the corresponding correlated color temperature, D50, which is a formalization of 5,000 Kelvin daylight. Daylight is sunlight subject to solar absorption, absorption and dispersion in Earth's atmosphere, and other phenomena, which cause some notching in the spectrum, as you can see in the red plot. But overall, daylight is still broad spectrum and relatively smooth and unimodal. Next slide. Let's look again at the spectral power distributions of daylight and tungsten that I showed earlier. In particular, on the left, we have CIE D55, and on the right is ISO Studio Tungsten. The entire motion picture film imaging chain was built on the presumption of daylight or incandescent illumination. And digital cameras are also optimized for this kind of lighting. This was enshrined in an ISO standard 7589, which specifies the illuminance to be used for evaluating camera films. Next slide. But then along came light-emitting diodes. LED lighting offers attractive benefits in cinema production, as you all know, including reduced size, power consumption, and heat, but its spectral power characteristic differs significantly from that of the natural sources, tungsten and daylight, that are assumed by ISO 7589 and assumed by photographic practice. LEDs tend to have sharply multimodal SPDs that are unlike that of blackbody emission. Spikes and troughs or dips in an illuminance SPD can cause undesirable color perception by both human vision and cameras of skin, costumes, and props that can't be fixed in post. Next slide, please. Cinematographers started realizing that often these over and underrepresented wavelengths cannot be corrected either in production by normal color correction filters and gels, or in post-production by primary color correction. So here's an example of a scene shot with tungsten illumination on the left, and then shot with LED illumination of the same correlated color temperature on the right. Philippe will be showing more examples of this later in this session. Next slide. Evaluating the suitability of LED lighting is difficult because, as I've mentioned, the inadequacies for cinematography of existing metrics are particularly evident with LED illuminants due to their multimodal SPDs. For example, this graphic is a simulation of a segmented Macbeth chart demonstrating the color reproduction differences between 3 different cameras with a particular LED light source. The simulated illuminant, which has a spectral power distribution shown by the yellow curve in each of the 3 graphs, has a CRI of 92. In each of the 24 color patches, the top segment shows the color as seen by the eye, and the lower left, central, and lower right segments simulate how the color of the patch illuminated by the same LED source is seen by each of the three cameras, respectively. So the three graphs show the RGB spectral sensitivities also of the three cameras. So hopefully these subtle differences are making it through PowerPoint and Acrobat and Zoom. Next slide. So there's a problem. The anchor of color cinematography, standard lighting, has come unmoored with non-Planckian light sources such as LED. And this is compounded by the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, previously existing color rendering metrics were designed for human vision or television cameras and not for cinema cameras. So they can be particularly unreliable predictors of the color rendering capability of LED lighting. And since there's no single standard for the spectral sensitivities of digital cinema cameras, not only do they see light differently than human vision, they see light differently from one another. So a metric for cinema lighting quality cannot presume any one particular set of sensitivities. That is, no metric to evaluate lighting based on a single set of spectral sensitivities will work generally for any camera. Next slide. As a result, cinematographers had no tools to reliably predict color rendering. So the Academy Science and Technology Council convened a solid-state lighting project committee to investigate these issues. We worked with cinematographers, cinema lighting experts, lighting manufacturers, and lighting, imaging, and camera scientists and engineers. The committee concluded that a metric was needed that compares a cinema light source to a known trusted reference source independent of camera sensitivities and expresses its similarity to it. For motion picture cinematography, knowing that a source's SPD is similar to that of a reference, such as daylight or tungsten, would provide confidence that color rendering will match that by the reference source. Next slide. As a solution, the project committee developed the Spectral Similarity Index, or SSI, which has been standardized by SMPTE as SMPTE ST2122. It's basically a tool for cinematographers that quantifies the predictability of light sources. Next slide. The SSI compares the SPD of a lighting fixture to that of a specified reference source, which is typically black body at a specified color temperature or CIE daylight at a specified CCT. So this figure illustrates the basic concept. The yellow curve, which is the one that's relatively straight, I'm not sure the yellow and white lines distinguish themselves here. The yellow curve is the spectrum of the reference source against which we have chosen to measure our fixture. So in this case, the reference source is black body emission with a warm color temperature. And the white curve, the wavy one, is the spectrum of the light fixture that we're measuring. In this case, in this example, it's an LED fixture with a similarly warm correlated color temperature. Basically, what SSI does is measure how similar the two curves are by looking at the variance between them, shown here shaded in blue, and then expresses the magnitude of the similarity as a value up to 100, where 100 indicates a spectrum that's identical to that of the reference. The less the difference, the higher the SSI value. Next slide. Determination of the SSI of a light source requires measurement of the spectral power distribution of the source and of the reference against which it is compared. This is measured with a spectrometer or spectroradiometer. Note that a colorimeter which measures only XY chromaticity, is not sufficient. It's not capable of providing that measurement. Next slide. Specifically, the test and reference spectra are considered across the range of 375 to 675 nanometers. And from those spectra, a relative difference vector is calculated, and that's then weighted and smoothed, and the SSI is calculated and expressed as a value up to 100. Again, as I indicated, where 100 means that the spectrum is the two spectra are identical. The precise calculation is defined by the SMPTE standard. You don't need to know the details, but if you're interested, it is summarized in a white paper available on the Academy website, where there's also an online SSI calculator that computes SSI from data that you can copy and paste from a spreadsheet. There'll be a QR code on my last slide that will take you to these pages. Next slide, please. SSI values must always be denoted with respect to the reference spectrum to which the text fixture is being compared, which is indicated within square brackets as shown in these examples. The details of how to specify the reference are defined by the SMPTE standard and again summarized in the Academy overview. The examples here are a blackbody or Planckian source of 3200 Kelvin and D55. Next slide. We are encouraging lighting manufacturers to quote the SSI values of their lights on their spec sheets and collateral material, along with the other customary indices, so that this information is readily available to cinematographers and gaffers. A number of lighting manufacturers are already doing this. If this is done, it shouldn't be necessary for anyone in production to measure SSI on their own, but we are also encouraging spectrometer manufacturers to include SSI calculation in their devices, as a number already do. The SSI-capable handheld spectrometers that we're aware of are listed here from AssenseTech, Sekonic, and UPR Tech. Next slide. To recapitulate the key features of the Spectral Similarity Index, I've listed them out here. It's primarily intended for cinematographic use and is purpose-built for the improved evaluation of motion picture lighting. It indicates the similarity of a test illuminant spectrum to that of a reference illuminant. It is a measure of the predictability of color rendering in cinematographic reproduction. It is independent of any spectral sensitivity. It's been standardized as SMPTE ST2122, and it is being adopted by manufacturers of cinema lighting and spectrometers. Next slide. So in summary, the major points here are that LED lighting does not conform to characteristics of natural lighting, and existing rendering quality metrics are not reliable for cinema cameras, especially with LEDs. And SSI is expressly designed to compare cinema lighting to reference sources, thus providing cinematographers a better confidence factor in their choice of lighting. We also believe that as cinema lighting manufacturers work to improve the spectral quality of their LED-based fixtures, SSI can be a better metric for defining performance targets and gauging development progress of new lights. Next slide. For more information on SSI, you can go to oscars.org/SSI, which this QR code will take you to. And there you'll find the white paper I mentioned that goes into more detail about SSI's development and calculation. There's also the SSI calculator I mentioned that lets you copy and paste spectral data from a spreadsheet and computes SSI value. And there's also some more information about the Academy's prior work investigating LED lighting. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand it back to Alex.
Thank you, George. That was a really interesting presentation. For me, I think there were a few really interesting. One in particular is that when we're looking at that chromaticity diagram where you had plotted the CCTs on the isotemperature lines, I think it may not necessarily be obvious, but when you think about it, you can have a CCT, say 6,500 or 5,500, and anything on that perpendicular line that has a CCT of that value. But by definition, because they're different chromaticities, they are different colors. And in fact, there are different colors in some cases that we can perceive as different as humans, but they all measure as having the exact same color temperature. I think there was a slide here, and maybe it's the next one up, where, I put this together ahead of time. You talked about these color rendering metrics, CRI, TM30, TLCI, and SSI. And in the case of the color rendering metrics, SSI, strictly speaking, isn't really a color rendering metric. But in the case of the three there that are color rendering metrics, there is an observer in that calculation, two of which are human, and one of which is a 3-chip HD TV camera. Likewise, there are a limited number of samples that light is being bounced off of and observed by, and that is part of the calculation. It's worth noting that SSI does not either have an observer or a sample, and the calculation is done by directly measuring, as you pointed out, the difference between the spectral power distributions of the test source and the reference source. We have some time now for question and answers, 15 minutes. Nothing has popped up in the chat. I don't know if there is anybody who has got anything that they'd like to bring up. If you want to raise your hand or maybe just unmute yourself, I can give you the floor, and we can go through questions. All right. Alex just posted that please post your questions in the question and answer session here. By the way, the questions aren't just for George here. If you have any questions about John Christian's LED light that he created to simulate basically firelight, or Felix's tests and perspective as a colorist, those are fair game as well. Patrick, you have a question here regarding polarization of light sources. Do you want to unmute yourself? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Feel free to ask verbally.
Actually, I'm not really aware of what I am asking, but what I have heard many times is when you're using LED moving lights, especially, most of them are built around a laser or LED, but when it's done around an LED engine, I've heard that the polarization could be a trick and could push us in a weird position through the camera. In other words, with your own eyes, everything is okay, almost okay, if you can trust your eyes. And then suddenly with the camera, it shows something different.
So that's not quite sure how to address that problem.
Maybe there's
Niels. Polarization is a tricky thing. It certainly is a tricky subject for the purpose of color measurement. Color measurement can be thrown off by polarization. Obviously, it affects the light that is going into the camera. Polarization, for those of you who don't know, has to do with sort of the direction of the light as it's going into the camera. And if you're, I mean, I suspect many of you are familiar with polarizing filters. If light is coming in sort of perpendicular to the filter's sort of direction, it'll filter that light out, but will allow light that's parallel to pass through. Again, very, very tricky for color measurement. I'm not sure of specific concerns here with regards to color rendering, but yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go with Niels. You got your hand up.
Yeah, unrelated to polarization, although maybe Alex, you wanted to comment on the polarization?
But maybe it's a fake question.
Alex, then you go first. I have a question for George about SSI. You're muted, Alex.
Sorry, it seems to me that I switched it off. So we made several tests. We're just at the beginning of this process, and we found that yes, polarization is shifting at certain zones and creating changes. How big those changes could be, it's a question, and we don't have the ready-made answer. But I think the question itself, what Patrick is asking, is very valuable, because I cannot say that it's dramatically changing color representation, but it's obviously providing changes. And how far we can go and what combinations of different filters, both on the light side and the camera side, reflection from the mirror type surfaces, it may give us a very important kind of support, especially in the gaps where in the spectrum of the LEDs representing the shortage of energy. It cannot fill it up completely, but it's creating a shift which gives amazing effect. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
So Niels?
Yeah. Yeah, George, thank you for your presentation. Really interesting. And then, you know, we met before and I've been following your work for quite some time. So thank you for all your efforts at the Academy and your team. My question is around the tolerance, the nanometric tolerance that you chose. Do I remember correctly that you started at 10 nanometers and then you moved down to 5? And can you kind of explain how you made that choice of the tolerance calculation on comparing one spectrum against another?
The standard specifies that the measurements be taken at least 5 nanometer increment. In other words, no coarser than 5 nanometers, and then that gets filtered and smoothed to across 10 nanometers. And I think the feeling was when this was developed that very narrow spikes that might get lost in that whole filtration, sampling and filtration process are not going to significantly impact the rendering of color or perception of color, because if the spike is very narrow, there's just not that much energy there. And Alex may have some other things to add to that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a sort of good overview there. This was very much considered at the time that the index was calculated. What we didn't want to do was sort of overly bias the calculations. Fluorescent light sources in particular, they can be quite spiky, but they can also be used quite successfully within cinematography. So there was a goal of sort of trying to balance between making sure that spectra which were dissimilar and problematic were being penalized, effectively penalized, I'll put in quotes, but light sources that were dissimilar, but not necessarily problematically so, were not sort of being unduly penalized.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you for the question. I think, Alex, question there?
Yes, I would also, I think that the detailed explanation also triggering questions, because on one of the slides it was stated that it's not dependent on any spectral response or spectral sensitivity of particular camera. But actually, I think it will be fantastic. When I was looking at the graphics and comparison, and its comparison with the black body, which is basically theoretically clean source. So it just indicates how far away we are from the clean source. And then basically, as soon as it's digital parameters in the certain system of coordinates, and as in a sensor tech, for instance, we have this comparison mode where you can get different presentation of values acquired from the light sources. It will be quite easy to apply the filter which indicates the spectral response of the camera, particular camera. And then in addition to the comparison with the black body, it may also represent the possible variations of the color presentation, I would say, by using the index for each particular camera. It's just maybe as a possible kind of step for the future.
Yeah, there is certainly additional work that can be done here. I don't think SSI was ever intended to be the end-all be-all. What it was intended to do was sort of move the conversation forward. Many people aren't aware of these differences in spectral power distribution between light sources. And when we started this work, many people were talking about light sources simply with regards to their correlate color temperature. So this has certainly raised awareness. There are always caveats to this, and in general, testing is always the recommended path.
Yeah, we're not
the light source.
The intent was not to discourage people or dissuade them from doing testing. If you have the time and resources to test and individual cameras, that's great. I think part of the motivation for SSI was to minimize the need to do that, or if you're unable to do that, what could we provide that would increase the, as I mentioned, the confidence factor, especially if you're using multiple camera types and so on. So it hopefully reduces the need for individual testing. But if you want to do testing, or you want to test against individual cameras and sensitivities and so on, that's great. Alex, I see there's another couple of questions in the chat.
We are at time now. We do have a coffee break for 10 minutes. I believe the idea is to leave the mics open. Is that correct, Philippe? So if people want to continue to discuss this, Jan, feel free. But we are now in the coffee break section, which will last for 10 minutes, and then we will get started with additional presentations at 11 o'clock. Like I said, Jan, if you are interested in sort of asking your question here in the middle, or David, likewise, I see your hand is up. Feel free.
Yeah, I can go very quick. I think actually what Alexei described is another version of what I just asked, because if you overlay the camera sensitivity, which is essentially the same chart, and see where they cancel each other out or where they amplify each other, suddenly it gets actually more valuable for a cinematographer, because you can then not only see if this is a high quality light, but is it also a high quality light relative to a specific camera. It seems like just a natural extension in my mind.
Yes,
Yeah,
and actually one thing I didn't specifically, sorry, Alex, one thing I didn't specifically mention is that a low SSI does not necessarily mean you're going to get poor rendering quality. And in fact, a particular camera may be very well matched to a particular light or vice versa. So even if its SSI is low. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
No, I was just going to throw in that, you know, sometimes it can seem quite intuitive to look at, you know, light sources versus spectral sensitivities overlaid on the same graph. And sometimes those integrations can be a little deceiving. So you really actually have to go through the math and calculate and to get the net effect. But I would just be a little careful just by looking at plots on graphs. Approach with caution.
Let's answer David's question. He raised the hand, and then we can go for the coffee break.
Yeah, I just wanted to have, thanks, Alex. Just wanted to have more clarification about the SSI number. Trying to understand. So my understanding, it's always based, or the calculation is based on the black body that you specify between brackets. So how, if you look at one specific number, you look at the black body and with a different number with a different black body, I mean, how do those two numbers relate to each other?
Actually, it's with reference to whatever reference illuminant you choose. So it really, you would typically measure a light fixture against the kind of illumination that it's trying to duplicate. So you can choose either black body illuminants or CIE daylight or other CIE standard illuminants. There's a bunch listed, and you can even measure against any arbitrary source, and the standard actually defines how you what you put in the brackets if it's not sort of one of the usual, doesn't fall into one of the usual categories or standard illuminants.
Okay, so you wouldn't just compare SSI numbers between all and every kind of number. You need to know that reference.
Well, so for instance,
in the first place, otherwise it doesn't make. I mean, what I'm saying, it's a specific LED light can be very good at providing a good color rendition for a specific reference, or either black body or CIE, than won't be as good with a different reference. Am
that's
I'm sorry
correct.
if I'm,
No, that's correct. So the SSI will any given light would have a different SSI depending on what it's measured against. So that's why we mandate that the reference be specified, so you know what you're looking at. And you know, an LED that's trying to, you know, that's looking to replicate 2700 Kelvin tungsten illumination will probably choose 2700K as its reference. Something that's looking to mimic daylight will choose one of the daylights, but you can measure it against anything.
no, that's great. Well, thank you for the clarification. And now it makes a lot of sense what Alex was proposing, to compare not only with different type of camera and sensors that have their own specificity, but at the same time, it makes things a little bit more complicated for people, or at least for the end user, to make sure that they are not just looking at the SSI number and say, oh, yeah, that's a great number and it will work for whatever. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
A coffee break, 10 minutes.
All right, everybody, we will reconvene here in just about 10 minutes and start with more presentations. Welcome back, everybody, from the coffee break. Thank you, and we're going to get going here with some additional presentations. Very much focused on the practical use of LED lights from cinematographers. Likewise, we have a few manufacturers here to give us their thoughts on LED lighting. Our first presentation is from Philippe Ross. I think everybody knows Philippe. So Philippe, I will turn the floor over to you and your presentation. So take it away.
Sound. Okay. Do we see do you see the screen?
Yep.
We
all
do.
good.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
So it's about the Conference of Light LED test, which has been made in Berlin in May 2019. It has been made with Michael Carstens from the rental house in Berlin, Tim Bruckner, a gaffer in Berlin, and Nick Shapley organized all those things, which is with the director of LCA in London. Basically, we had 12 LED lighting fixtures. We tested them with different skin tones, different level of lights, and different color temperatures. Basically, a very simple setup: backlight, tungsten light for backdrop, and tungsten light for the key light, and of course to fill in on the left side of the face. So we did also the test, of course, in different color temperature using HMIs. But what we will show today is the difference between this setting and this setting with LEDs. So the idea is to show the difference with the same setting on the tungsten light, what happened when you applied it on LEDs. And I will use Flipbook methodology to see very fast the way we feel the difference of skin tones. So this is a large shot, and this is the reference, tungsten light. And now we're passing from Mastera, Aladdin, Cineolite, Cream Source, KinoFlow, KinoFlow Celeb, Light Gear Light Tile, DMG Roscoe, Aries Sky Panel. So for this series of tests, what do we see? We have no intention to judge the quality of each LED. And the idea was to see what happens to skin tone when you use different brands of LEDs on set, which is basically what happens most of the time. For the close shot, let's see the reference, which is on the right. And for example, the Astera, Cineo, Cream Source, KinoFlow, Celeb, Light Gear Light Tile, DMG, Aries Sky Panel. So can we fix these differences in post? As George said, no. So how to judge the quality of a LED? So we have the spectrum before, and the spectrum, for example, of the tungsten reference, I want to compare with the different LEDs. LED 1, LED 2, LED 3, LED 4, LED 5, LED 6, LED 7, LED 8, LED 9, and 10. So basically, we have the spectrum, which give a lot of difference, as you see, and George spoke about the distribution of the spectrum, which would be continuous, as smooth as possible, with a particular peaks and dips. So this is a way to see if you will enter in a problematic, and I think it's very important. So the broadness of the spectrum is also an important parameter. And of course, this is seen in post-production with the colorist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Excellent. Next up, we have Niels de Montagon, who is going to talk about the tools that manufacturers need to validate LEDs. So, Niels.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everybody. And Uwe Greiner from Gaffer from Germany, ICLS is gonna, well, we're gonna make this into a little bit of a conversation. So I handle Roscoe's LED lighting business unit. I'm one of the co-founders of DMG Lights, and as you can all imagine, when we heard about SSI, we were happily surprised that that some people around the world were looking at comparing a spectrum against another, because the genesis or origin of the DMG Roscoe acquisition or marriage was to reproduce Roscoe gels, hard gels, rolls of plastic in front of tungsten or HMI sources into digital LED gels. And so, the concept of spectrum matching for us was critical to our product development. And so, when we did meet with George and Alex in LA, I think it was maybe 2017 or 2018, in a coffee around Cinegear. And it was great to see that some science behind spectrum matching was being put together. But Uwe, I'll bring you in now. Going back for 1 second, but we chose our emitters in a way, and the mixed technology from Roscoe has 6 different emitters for those who are familiar with it. In an earlier presentation from Christian, he mentioned the lime and the amber that we added to our technology. We chose those emitters in order to reproduce the largest possible range of gels, of true gels. And again, a very subjective concept to call a true Roscoe gel on an LED source. Our testing were done with the eye, with camera sensors. And then we internally at Roscoe said, okay, this is true and this is less true, without any metric, just some subjectivity. But Uwe, bringing you into the discussion and not talking by myself, we've heard so much that a film set wasn't a lab where it's just so complicated to get this. You can get your tools out, right? But you can't. Are you able to? Do you have the time to? Or other question: what problems do you have matching sources, and how do you solve your problems? Maybe is a good first question for you.
Yeah, I think it's the biggest issue in the moment is because you have so many manufacturers out there, and let's say each manufacturer has its benefit, and the result in the end is that you have 8 or 9 manufacturers on set, like LED wise. So for example, in the show that I'm doing now, it's it's like a $100 million show, and we have on day 80, and we had 4 days with HMI. We don't have tungsten with us. We only have LED fixtures more or less, so we only use them, and we have around, let's say, 10 manufacturers, and that is for us, of course, the biggest issue to get them all on the same track. And it's there's a lot of testing in the beginning, and so for me, the SSI is like helpful because sometimes you can check if the special fixture that you have, is it on the quality that it should be, so that I know upfront, okay, I have now, for example, sky panels. They are on the market for 6 years and they're used so much. So the LEDs are changing on that sky panels from time to time. So I compare, and before we start shooting on the test, is it still the sky panel it was like 5 years ago. So, but for me upfront, it's just to test all the fixtures I have with me. What's the quality? That's. So
you're saying like you work ahead. You work on LED sources way ahead of a shoot, understanding how they work and what's how good of a quality they are, and then you make your decision or your list based on that knowledge that you've acquired ahead of time.
Yeah, if I have, let's say, I don't know, 8 light mats, I have to test 13 to find the 8 that are doing what they should. So that's for me, because to be honest, and the professional manufacturers are all more or less on a very good range. So what I heard from my DPs. So
are you saying that LED with LED is less and less of a problem in terms of color matching than maybe it was before, or
I guess that's my feeling, because in the end I'm not in the grading, to be honest. So I'm not invited normally. So I don't know how it's in the end, but so all DPs that I'm talking to, they tell me that
it works.
The mix might create a problem, but not the LED itself.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that actually is a very interesting point. Mixing light sources versus using, sort of a consistent set of light sources. Maybe that's something we can dive into a little bit later. Ube, thank you very much. I forgot to mention that we're sort of doing these presentations in groups of 2. So the next 2 up are Julian White and Mark Galleron. And they're, Julian's gaffer, and Mark's the CEO of K5600. So if you guys want to take over, go for it.
Hey, Mark. Hey, hello, everybody.
Hi, Julian.
Hey, ça va?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. It's very sad that we only have good LED manufacturer at this conference. As you know, we've been around for quite a bit, and we specialize in HMIs, and it took us a very long time to make the step to LEDs, and in a very, very shy way. And a few reasons to this, because there was already existing unit on the market, and especially the panels. And sorry, we're mostly famous for doing direct lighting. So and we like shadows a lot, and which is quite difficult to do with LEDs. It's been difficult to adjust to something which is totally different, and especially there's a lot of talk about heat and whether it's Niels or Frieder, this is the main problem for LEDs and the aging of LEDs and how long you're going to keep the unit, and what Uwe was saying about picking up, having to go through 11 lights to get 9 that would from the same brand that would work together. It's basically only because there's each light has its own history. It's not like when you use one lamp, if you use one tungsten bulb or HMI bulb, you just replace it every now and then, and you get back to square one. When you have RGB plus whatever, the same light is going to have be on a chroma key shoot, only using blue for 2 months, or and every light then gets his own history. So that makes it a little difficult to do this. For us, we really start to doing bicolor. And we can't afford to go to RGBW whatever, because our market is unfortunately dominated by Chinese suppliers, and you have to be a big company, and you need a lot of resources to be able to have access to products. So we're not into that, and again, I'm totally happy with that. I mean, there's no, I'm not saying LED is bad. I'm not saying all of this. I'm just saying that there's limitation to LEDs, and there will always be, unless you can change the law of physics. And yeah, one of them is heat. And when you start to work on cobs, as small as possible to have a good, to get good shadows, and especially matching with Fresnel lenses, you have to deal with a light emitting diodes which can stand not much more than 100 degrees C when you have 450 degrees C with a light bulb. And this is going to affect. So I know the people around, whether it's Roscoe, GMG, or Kinoflow are working on this and putting products on the market which are meant to last. Unfortunately, that's not the majority of suppliers, and we're turning into a business where it's you keep rental companies keep units for 1 year and then throw them away. I know it's also one of the things about LEDs is the saying, there's no it's green, it's green ecology, not green color, and it's not. I mean, it's not. It is if you manufacture properly. If you make units which are going to cost $1,000 but are going to last 4 months or 6 months, it's not, because the recycling is a bit difficult. But
Julian, you have you're a gaffer. You have sort of a very practical perspective on this.
Sure.
What is your experience with LEDs and in particular?
I've just been thinking, actually, I have less problem with color balancing now than I ever have, because obviously, the old days between tungsten, fluorescent, HMI, trying to mix those up, and then I know DOPs go into the grade and struggle a lot of the time with green spikes and stuff like that. I'm very happy with what I have. And I think it's a very valid thing to try and iron out problems and solve those, create those, in a test situation or a lab, to try and make those, refine those more and more. But a bit like Mark was saying, I think there's so many parameters from when the lamp is manufactured to when we get it, and how many years it's been, and whether it's the same batch, and has it been bashed around or left in the damp and things like that. And then also when we're on the shoot, there's so many things of ambient temperature, atmosphere, all these different things. And I've never been a person who gets very picky about things like that, because I quite like the variation in things. And it's frustrating, obviously, when HMIs were very green or very magenta and you'd have to swap them out. But I quite like the organic thing about light. Well, I love the organic thing about light, and I'm worried that we're trying to flatten it out a little bit, and a bit like jazz music against, or analog music against digital, that we're losing a bit of the substance. And I think it's all valid, and I'm glad for it, but the practicality of it, doing it on set, like Uwe was saying, is very difficult. But there's so many variations. And then also, as human beings, we sense light in very different ways, and we have an understanding of what colors are. But really, it's such a very organic, very varied thing. I kind of struggle to find it. It's a bit like taste or music or sound or whatever, that you can really pinpoint things so accurately that if it's that far out, you'd notice, I think. And if it's there's an organic feeling about it, and the digital world is trying to flatten it a little bit. And as I said, I think it's very valid what people are doing, but as it gets closer to race day or the shoot day, it gets more difficult to really deal with it, and you have to be much more kind of fluid with it, I guess. So I know it's a difficult. I never heard of SSI until a week ago, so it's really fascinating.
Fair enough. So we do have Frieder and Alex up next.
Can I just sorry?
Yeah, sure.
Can I just say one thing just to finalize? I absolutely love LED. Since I've started using it, and I've done half my career without and half with. But I love it, and the flexibility it gives me. If there's the color variations were that bad, I wouldn't use it. But I absolutely love its fluidity and its ability to instantly change things, and it's revolutionized my world much for the better. And I think the range of colors we have are fantastic. So all power to you guys to try and sort it out to make it better. But yeah, it's really good. Thank you. That's it.
I just trying to give you guys the best tools possible to make awesome movies.
Thank you very much.
All right, Frieder and Alex, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, I just have a few comments after listening to all of this, which thank you very much for putting all this together. I think these are all valid discussions. One of the earlier comments was about the, averaging the curves and whatnot. When it came to spikes, now fluorescents were all about spikes, and the mercury line was a green line, which introduced green into it. So it was a very narrow band. So recognizing that was an influence on the spectrum, we were able to adjust. And this is where it goes back to the whole concept of spectral distribution in XY. So the trick was we understood the spectral distribution. It had spikes, and we needed to understand the influence on the film response. we knew that it was making green. So what we did is we made sure that we took the XY coordinates and put them back on the Planckian. The film followed very closely to the Planckian curve. So that was one way to say, listen, this, the lamp has a distribution with green in it, but we've now put sufficient other spectral data into the phosphor blend to negate the green, which was essentially magenta. So if somebody came up, remember they used to walk around with a little crystal that they would look through it and go, oh, I see a green spike. Yes, of course, the technology in and of itself embodies that green spike, but we're able to knock it down into a neutral zone because we understood what that influence had on the film. So that was just sort of a comment on the side. Now, one of the things that all of these indexes that we have to work with, what they all have in common is that there's no actionable data coming off of it. So it really comes down to gathering experience with all these different means of characterizing light and understanding how that relates to what we need to do, and that is ensure a consistent quality of light on the set. And so I think SSI is the first step in that direction, but as some of the comments that have come out of the other discussions here is, in the end, it still relates to what is the camera eye seeing. And we need some sort of actionable metric that will allow us to correct for the things that are obvious to us. Now, since the introduction of the iPod, the whole concept of good enough is now become sort of a social norm for us. And so we need to keep that in mind, that everything that we're doing here is a compromise. We're trying to shoehorn a technology which in and of itself is discontinuous into an application that requires continuous spectrum. The 450 spike alone already knocks out the lower portion of the blue sensitivity. Now, some cameras knock down at that range anyway, and they actually harmonize quite well with a 450 exciter line. Other cameras reach a little more into the ultraviolet. So there's actual spectral data that the camera could capture, which is not available in the LED. So that in and of itself sets up a dynamic where different cameras are going to see the same spectrum differently. So,
Alex, I don't know if you want to jump in here and add anything, but I couldn't agree with you more, Fruder. There's so many points I could highlight here, but excellent comments.
Yeah. So for that reason, we basically said we need to understand the camera, and we created our own spectrometer to try to analyze it. And one of the key points of when we talk about the degradation of LED technology, absolutely right. Heat is the killer of the spectral quality of an LED. And for that reason, it was always important for us to underdrive, which on the one hand played against us, because in a market that is about brightness, they go, well, that's cool, but this one's a little brighter. And in the end, our focus on trying to get the color right and consistency had no bearing in the market. It was like, the other ones are brighter. And this seems to, unfortunately, still dominate our market today. It's brighter. Oh, by the way, it's cheaper. So, it is what it is.
Yes, I would be always shy to jump into conversation, and I always prefer to listen to Frida, because his knowledge and his input in the color perfection and lighting character and specialty is incredible, and so I really appreciate it. And from my side, I would say that I found SSI as a fantastic beginning, because in my mind, the way of interpolation the data is quite important, and it's offering amazing perspectives for the future. And I would say that, of course, this statement that SET is not a lab, that's absolutely true, and I will vote with two hands for that. But the question is that there is a prep period, and if there is nothing done in a prep period, SET is not a lab. SET becoming a disaster zone. And SSI is a fantastic meeting point when cinematographer can talk to the colorist and to find the dangers, because if you have in a certain spectral zones practically zero energy, it cannot be fixed in the post unless it's a kind of a becoming a CGI, and then it's getting too expensive and too difficult and too whatever. So I think that this interpolation concept, we have to think also about the dramatic changes in the presentation of lighting. Depends on the style of cinematography performed on the set. It can be low key or high key, and of course it's immediately impacting a color presentation. And then some of the deviations which may be not so dramatic, like in the air values like CRI, may be turning into the big problem. And having all of this again as a meeting point and collecting ideas and transferring those to the fantastic team who is taking care about this, like kind of a new method of evaluation, I think it will give us incredible options. And also, I think also Frida mentioned that the longevity of LEDs, especially monocolor LEDs, is extremely short. And it's all LEDs are aging as people, like differently. And also the consistency within the range, like comparing from the same manufacturer, different light heads, it also gives incredible fast results, which at least as an alarm is quite important. Thank you very much.
One thing.
Yeah,
just one thing to add to that. You know, the whole idea of LEDs aging, absolutely. And I think the goal now is to, amongst the higher end manufacturers, is to come up with a methodology where these fixtures can self-calibrate. Again, all of these things come at a price, and we have a market that's very price sensitive. And I think convincing the market that there is value in this, I think is the bigger challenge. So technically, we can produce some of the most amazing stuff, but when you look at the cost of bringing it to market, you know, we've got marketing people now that just look at me and go, "You got to be kidding me! Who's going to pay for this?" Nobody wants to pay for it, especially when you've got when you have a market that is segmented. You've got your high end that I think has an appreciation for it, but then you have a very large middle section that doesn't fully appreciate all the nuances of what we're trying to build into these units, and they don't care. And so it leaves you at a point where you have to say, we got to make some money on this deal. We can't just target the top end. We need to go for that 80% of the market. What are they going to take? And I think that's going to be our bigger challenge. So unless it comes from the high end pushing it down and saying we need to have these features, and that's where hopefully the industry will talk back and say these are the things that are important to us, and support manufacturers that are trying to deliver on their product.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. I don't think SSI was ever intended to be a silver bullet, right? It's information that brings forward the issue. For years, cinematographers didn't have to think about, the light bulb and the light very much. Now they need to think about it a little bit more. And the economics, the technology will sort itself out, but getting people aware of issues is, I think, probably the most important thing from our perspective. Alex, do you want to say one more thing, and then we'll move on to Tim Kang?
Just a very last one. I want to make a big compliment to Rosco, because many manufacturers are using now Rosco gel filter numbers in their menus. And I think this is, and in the Rosco mix book, it's not available. And I think this is a fantastic warning, because as cinematographer, like for instance, as Julian mentioned, in the past, you have your light, you have your filter, you know exactly what you're getting. With LEDs, with a mixture, when using gel filter numbers, it may create an illusion that you know where you're going, but in reality, you actually entering the world of unexpected surprises. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. At this point, maybe we'll jump over to Tim Kang. Tim also works for a lighting manufacturer, but is also a cinematographer. He is very familiar with SSI. So Tim, if you want to take it over, you can do a screen share too if you want to share your presentation, or if you have any slides you want to share.
I had emailed yesterday saying I can't do a screen share because I'm on a I was on a shoot. I'm on a shoot and I don't have access to my computer.
I think we're prepared to run your slides. Here they come.
Yeah. Okay, great, cool. This is who I am. I'm a principal engineer for color and imaging. I would never call myself a color scientist. I respect color scientists too much to put myself in that category. But I'm also a cinematographer. I went to AFI a while ago, and I, made movies and documentaries and everything in between. So I understand both worlds. But I also have a technical background. I studied biomedical engineering. So that's where I can sort of bridge the gap between all these different worlds. So can you go to the next slide, please? So the big question about SSI, I think, really is what is it good for me that cinematographers and gaffers have? And I've thought about this in a very deep level and on a usage-based level for about 4 years now, on a very active level. And what I have found that really helps folks is to explain that this is a tool to help you with your lighting control, and it's a tool to help you for having confidence in your color of your light. And I'm keeping that broad from now, but if you go to the next slide, there needs to be a foundation to understand what's going on. So first, we know there's color science, but what is it? Well, really, color science is two aspects. There's psychology and physics, and you combine the two words together, and you call it psychophysics. And if you go to the next slide, when you're dealing with lighting, the organizing principle here is that light emits some sort of energy, and objects modify the energy, and observer receives that energy, interprets it, right? And when we're usually talking about color science in photography, we have a problem with thinking about more just the observer side of it. But with lighting, with SSI, it's the first tool available to us as filmmakers, and is to be able to say, what is the actual thing that I have, right? If I have a certain spectrum, how do I understand it? So to understand that, if you go to the next slide, I like the term radiometry, because it's basically, if you delineate the terms radiometry and colorimetry, radiometry is the physics, and it's what's the actual thing that I'm working with. And light in this case has a certain color, right? But it's actually a spectrum of energy, and objects then modify that. So there's a final light that could come out as well that's modified, that goes to an eye. So if you go to the next slide, all the other metrics that exist out there are generally dealing with psychological color models of some sort in interpretation. So TM30, CRI, TLCI. So if you go to the next slide, the problem is that if you have multiple things with the same color, using color metric based values like TLCI, TM30, etc., they give you some sort of feedback on the differences between different spectrums that give you the same color, but they don't actually tell you what's going on. So at the very end of the, you can go to the next slide, and just keep advancing past this. Sorry. You can see that the differences between the colors, and the whole point of all this is that I'm trying to say that SSI is, if you go to the next slide, before we had colorimetric controls, where we just said warm and cool, magenta and green. But if you go to the next slide here, essentially you have radiometric controls that you can use SSI to tell you and gauge, if I change the spectrum for a given color, what do I have? How close am I getting? How am I matching two sources, etc. So at the very end of the slide here of the deck, if you just advance a couple more slides forward, I propose in this slide right here. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a common concept in psychology, saying that we as human beings have certain needs that must be met, and as you keep meeting them, eventually you get to happiness, or self-actualization, as he calls it. In the case of lighting color quality, the most basic need is, what is my actual spectrum I'm working with? And then I can start talking about colorimetry, right? So that if you go to the final slide here, the next slide, sorry, the radiometric, the only thing we have to gauge radiometry is SSI. And you can have any target source you want and say, is this light that I'm going to use matching my target source? It could be good white light, it could be sodium vapor, terrible light, it could be whatever. Then I can at least know what I have. So that's basically what I feel, gaffers care about. This is what they care about. They want to know, how close is this going to be for white light, but also what can I do for getting the exact light that I need on set for DP. So that ends my TED talk.
Thanks so much, Tim. I think your visuals, the pictures there, are particularly interesting. Kind of went by them quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time, but maybe we can revisit those later. Very interesting pictures. Now we're going to jump to John Christian again, who is just going to make a sort of brief analogy with sound for us, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure if it's interesting or not, but I'm just, as a cinematographer, this is it is. If I go back to my last movie, I made this beautiful booklet light because I wanted this film that was the soft. It's supposed to be very soft for the faces, and we started up with using some. I didn't want to tell you the name of it, but it was an LED used for that, and I had to stop using it because it really looked bad, and I had to go back to tungsten light. And suddenly I was relaxing on set, and it felt like, wow, this is now I'm back into something that it feels comforting to look at, and of course it looks nice in the camera. So in a way, it feels like we are now a place where we were when the MP3 music came to town, and we could have thousands of songs into a little player, and we were so fascinating by this because it gave us so many possibilities, but the quality was shitty. And for me, that is, if we go too far on this, we can have a lot of possibilities. We can do a lot with LEDs, but is it in the end of the day the quality we want to achieve as a cinematographer with the human face? Because the face is only the colors that we put into it, and if we put so few colors and with spikes and the colors are not so smart that they are not replicating the face and the skin tone, I'm not sure if this is where I would like to go, even though I'm deeply into LEDs, even though I'm using them every day. This is the question.
Nicely said, John Christian. Thank you very much. George, I'm going to turn it back over to you now. There's been a lot of things discussed here, a lot of perspectives. I'd love to sort of get some final thoughts from you as to how all these pieces fit together.
Thanks. Philippe, did you have something you wanted to add at this point? I saw you raising a hand.
Yes, just to asking John Christian to give the real reference with the sound, with the MP3.
Yeah, but that was the whole thing, that the MP3 compression and yeah, actually not more than that. When you compress something that far, you get sound, but the quality is so bad. With a raw recording, you have a different. You feel the difference with your ears, even though both are sound, both are the same song.
Well, it introduced the concept of good enough.
Absolutely. Sadly enough.
That's been embraced now for convenience. And in our industry, sadly, some of that's taking hold as well. It should.
But MP3 was the 90s, guys. Where there's MP4. We're all streaming sound. right
No,
now. We're all happy with it.
It's a concept of accepting something that is not as good as it was before. That's it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
You find it in photography. I have images of my family taken at the turn of the century, 1890, that are sharper than what I have from the photos that I took in the 70s of my family that were on 35 millimeter. Those are on glass plate and they're unbelievably sharp. So, but it's more convenient to shoot 35.
I know we'll get into some Q&A session, but for the moment, would just say to Alex's point, you know, when we developed SSI, we listened to cinematographers and gaffers. We were trying to create a solution to problems that existed. But now that the standard is out there, we're still interested in how SSI is being used and where it's falling short, or how things could be done better, or where it can be more useful. So this seminar here today is a great opportunity for us to hear your feedback and your thoughts. So we appreciate this opportunity. But I'll back to Alex, and I think we're going to open it up for more Q&A and discussion.
Yeah, George, one sort of area I'd love to hear your comments on is, you know, one area that LED lighting is being used a lot more is in virtual production, right? So virtual production walls are not only being used to display, you know, backgrounds, but and sets, but also to light the actors. How does SSI play a role in virtual production? And can you talk a little bit about LED walls versus LED luminaries?
Yeah, what SSI does is it shows what a big problem it is to try and light people with an LED wall, because there's a perfect example of trying to use something for something it wasn't intended for. So LED walls, or and LED panels were designed to display images, not to illuminate subjects. And so we had someone was actually measuring the SSI of an LED wall, and I had an email from him and said, I think I must be doing something wrong because I measured the SSI of my LED wall, and it was 14. What am I doing wrong? And I said, no, you're not doing anything wrong. That's exactly what it is, because with SS, when you're illuminating a face, you're going to get your best lighting if it's a nice smooth spectrum with no spikes or dips. And when you're looking at an LED wall, the best way to make an image is to have red, green, and blue. So it's the worst case. So it is a problem now, and I know some people. I just saw a demo from Frieder last week as among the people trying to address this issue and how you're doing things on set.
Yeah, it's interesting how everything kind of comes full circle, right? When SSI when we were starting this work, it purely related to these fixtures that were being used to illuminate subjects, but now we're having a whole nother conversation with manufacturers that we never thought we would have with virtual production. It's an interesting topic. We are again at a point where we have a question and answer session. I'd like to revisit a few things. Jan, I don't know if I gave you sort of appropriate time and focus on your question earlier in the session. If you want to take the floor to ask anything you want, feel free.
I'm all good, but thank you.
Okay.
Daniel has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, I just thanks. It's a very great presentation. So I'm really happy that we are all getting together and discussing all of those things. I wanted to. It's just like more of a comment to a few things. First of all, I think the greatest thing about SSI is the naming, because in the name it describes what it does, and it also describes what it not does. And we need to be careful to not interpret too much into it, because we had today, or even today in Uwe's talk, and then the answer of Julian, which I think was one of the very great contributions, is that we should not confuse similarity with quality. That is, I think, a very important thing, and this is what the SSI is not trying in a general sense to say, that if you have just a light source which is not similar to another light source, that doesn't say anything about the quality. It says a lot about the reproducibility, and that was also mentioned. And I think this is the best thing I can see the SSI is used for, is reproducibility. And in this, I would also agree with Tim, for example, to say that it is a tool. I would disagree with Tim to say it is a tool which informs you what to do if the number is low, because it doesn't provide any guidance to what to do if the number is low. So we need to be a little bit careful in using it, but I think it's the great strength, and also its great weakness is the missing of the observer. So we can do a lot of things in comparison, but to inform us to then take further decisions, it's where it's, I think, the end of that standard is, and I think that's totally acceptable and a very good thing. But we should not intermix quality and similarity in a general way. So that's all from my side.
Yeah, I think that's. I think you're making good points here, Daniele. You know, spectral similarity index was intended to do one thing, and it does it well. It provides information, but it is not the end all be all. For those who are not super technical, testing is the best thing to do. Testing is really important. Tim, I see your hand up. Take it away.
Yeah, that's why I was saying, you know, if this session is for cinematographers and gaffers, really cinematographers, ultimately we have to understand the utility of what the things we propose and use are, and the utility is very useful for manufacturers, because if a manufacturer is saying that I need to make a white light, then I have a tool to gauge. Well, if I go to 5 different manufacturers of my LED luminaire, which one is getting closest to my target? Well, the most important thing that exists out there is spectrum to say that this is as close to my target as I can get, right? Previously, before SSI existed, there was no simple way to do this, and I think that's why I think it's a fantastic tool for everybody involved, for manufacturers, for cinematographers, to say, if I needed a sodium vapor light, and I want it to really match real sodium vapor, I can find a way to gauge how close is my light going to match sodium vapor, not just in terms of a shade of color, but really in how it makes things look terrible in the way that I need it to look terrible on camera, right? And so that's why I also wanted to echo. I was responding to Danielle's comments that it's great because it's not an indication of quality, it's an indication of just what do I have? What is the thing that I have? Is this the thing that I need? And I think that's why it's such a great tool. So, and nothing existed before that for us to do that. So I just want to give much applause to the team, to you, to Alex and everybody involved, because we now have a simple mean, and it's in multiple meters in Taconic and UPR Tech, etc. To just say, here's my target source that I want, and is this am I getting close? That's all it comes down to, and I think that's so it's just great. I love it. So
yeah, drive carefully.
Oh, no, you're on mute, Tim. Maybe Philippe, let's go to you.
Yes, there is a point where I want to put some emphasis, is the duration of quality all along the life of LED. I made very interesting shift in one day on several sets pre-lighted with LEDs and not low budget LEDs. So I suspect that there was a problem, and I used 18% gray. I made a shot at the beginning of the day, and during the day I had 3 different targets on the vector scope. But my question is, SSI at this point can really show you, is it possible to show really the shift, or just you take the measurement and the measurement gives you the shift? Is it enough to know where you are?
Who's the question directed towards?
To George and to you, Alex.
George, do you want to maybe take that?
Sorry, Philippe, could you restate the question, please?
No, I mean, with the SSI, there is only one number, okay? And the metric, when you see a shift by your eye on LEDs, how can we react? What can we do at this moment? Because this is something which really happens. The shift of quality.
I think if you're meaning something that gets to the question of what Frieder said, which is what do you do? How do you answer? I think to get into that, then you need to start looking at spectra, and you need to start taking measurements and perhaps measuring the sensitivities of your camera. And then you're getting into a greater level of detail beyond what SSI by itself can provide.
Well, one of the things that happens is the spectrum may not change dramatically throughout the day, but if you were to look at in terms of its XY coordinates, you may see a shift that will account for that shift in color perception. So
but that's not a problem to fix, right? So that the SSI is still a great information, because if the colors drift, but the SSI reports a very high similarity, that just means you have an overall balance change somewhere, which is then easy to correct with the white balance. But if the colors are drifting and the SSI is dramatically changing, then you get metameric failures.
I'm suggesting the numbers are not going to change dramatically. I think that the subtlety is going to be when you actually read the XY, because that's the part that's the most perceptible also to the camera. If they see a green magenta shift, whether you see that shift in the overall spectral distribution, that's not going to be as dramatic. But you do see it dramatically in terms of XY, and it only has to deviate a little bit off the Planckian, and you're going into the magenta or you're going into the green. So spectrally, it's hard to judge that. So you may see a number shift. You know, through experience, you'll find out if it's 2 numbers off. Is that huge? It could be. I don't know. But I think it's worth exploring that to see how SSI throughout the day, how much it shifts and how that then correlates directly to an XY shift.
And one thing that gets into something I'd love to hear some feedback on from DPs and gaffers is, look at the SSIs of lights you've used and see how the SSI numbers correlate with your subjective evaluation of the lights. If the lights that you like using and have confidence in have high SSIs and the others don't, then that means it's a good predictor for you. If it doesn't, we'd love to know that.
Yeah, I was actually going to say it'd be quite
I've done this a
interesting
lot.
to do a blind tasting of that. See what it comes out like.
Yeah, I've done this testing a lot, and I've found general trends, but ultimately the real question is, what is the target, right? So if my target's white light, if we're talking about white light, then yeah, there is a correlation that you can track, and especially since cameras are calibrated to a certain spectrum, as I've heard, so yeah.
Tim, I agree with you, but as you said, the target, but also a dramatic target. Which type of film are you doing? Because when you want to grade in a realistic mode, maybe you won't see any shift of colors, but as soon as you really dig into the image, especially on skin tone or commercials or film with non-realistic images, you see the problems. And I think that's why we invited Felix, and we have Dirk Meyer, and of course it's very nice to have Danielle, because the relationship between the gaffer, the cinematographer and the colorist become more paramount each day with the LEDs.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. We got to remember where we were before SSI too. I think that's important. We had a bunch of manufacturers coming out with new LED panels, all stating things like, we're exactly 3200 Kelvin, and it's like, what does that mean? Especially when you're mixing those light sources with the traditional tungsten illuminates. SSI, I think, did a lot to make people aware of issues, also to raise awareness of spectral power distributions as opposed to just correlated color temperatures. Like we've said quite a few times here, it is not a silver bullet, but what it does is it advances the conversation and it allows people to understand that testing may be necessary for a certain panel and maybe a little less necessary with a different panel. But it by no means is the end all be all of color measurement, color reproduction. It's a complex topic, and there's a lot of different vectors that you could explore. I will give one last offer here for questions, comments. Certainly, if anybody has done anything with virtual production and mixing sources, that I think is a particular interest. But we've got 2 minutes left here in our time today. So
maybe do you have an outlook for, or do you have another? Let's say, because you said like it's not the end of it, it's just beginning. Does the Academy plan or has some ideas of what other tools in that area to provide, or where this could go, just as an outreach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, what we have done is provided the industry a tool, and we're still evaluating how that tool is being used. So I think the future is a little unknown as to what else is needed or we could do to help improve the situation. To other people's points too, we don't want to turn the set into a color science lab. We want to keep things practical and easy.
Yeah, I personally have found what is really useful is not having the single number, but seeing the deviations and differences that give me that number. Like, what are the differences between the two spectrums? What part of the spectrum? It's just a simple graph, just like how TM30 has a whole host of types of charts and graphs with their spec. I don't think it's out of bounds to say, hey, here's the spectrum differences between the two spectrums. And this is why you're getting that number. I think that's really, I think that would be a very helpful specification of just how do you graph that? What is useful with that graph? What does it tell you? Because it is really helpful. If I have an SSI of 76, where is that 25 going? Where am I deviating with that 25? That's really useful. That's something I can do. I can get a LED with violet, let's say, if it's in the violet region, I'll put some violet light, and start filling out that region. These are the sorts of things that I feel like would be great to have with SSI in the future on an official basis. Because I do it on my own. I could do it on my own. It's not for me, but I think for gaffers and DPs that don't have these tools, it'd be great to have that more clearly delineated and understood. So
I want to make one final comment, or not, by the way, but I also think that LED technology is going faster than the industry's speed of understanding what spectral data is. And so, again, not wanting to kill the work that's been done, very useful, but I still think that there's only a handful of people that understand how to read a spectral image. It's quite scientific and technical. And, we're sourcing LEDs now, which are, which carry nearly every single visible nanometers of visible wavelengths that exist. And so I think it must be part of the thinking to look at where LEDs are going in terms of spectral distribution. It's quite unbelievable. And so again, just a comment, because everything we're talking about is great, but I think the next LED is going to throw it all out of the water, because spectral will not be maybe not an issue anymore. And I'm exaggerating a little bit. There'll always be cheaper versions that can't afford or don't want to afford those high quality or high spectral LEDs, but things are moving fast in the world of LED, in the world of technology, very, very fast.
I would agree with that.
The problem goes away. I think we're all happy.
Yeah, well, I agree with Niels. I agree with you, and I think also that the cameras are starting to show much more similarities than in the past. So I think the convergence of all of those coming together is going to hopefully make our life a little easier. One can only hope.
How nice to end on a positive note.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. We are out of time today, but let's try to continue this conversation within our circles. By the way, I'd be remiss if I did not mention acescentral.com. We do have a forum there, and it is a place that you guys, if you want to sign up and talk about all things color imaging, lighting, it's all fair game. So acescentral.com, I'll just put that into the chat.
And if you do like SSI, ask your lighting vendors to start putting their numbers on their packaging and spec sheets.
Thank you very much, everybody. We will speak again soon. And thank you to all the panelists.
Yes, thanks to everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.